I've been a subscriber to the Slate Digital All Access Pass for a very long time now, and some people love the virtual mix rack, the way you can just switch modules around, put them all in one, essentially one plugin. Some people are maybe not quite as into it as I am, but I think it's a really useful way of doing things, and I love finding new ways of doing stuff. And I've found a way that we can create almost like a multi-band saturation or single band, depending on how you want to use it. I don't know what to call it, but we can mess around with saturation on a frequency dependent kind of way. Let's just check it out. So what I want to do here is saturate my snare, but I only want to saturate certain frequencies, or I want to saturate certain frequencies more than other frequencies. So what I can do is I can use an EQ in collaboration with a saturation device. Now, I've chosen to use the SSL EQ here, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment, but I'll show you the method first. So here's my snare. Sounds pretty good, but I want to lengthen that sustain on the top end and just saturate the top end a bit. And you know, saturation can be a kind of a lengthening thing, so I think that's going to be beneficial for this snare. What I want to do is load in 2 instances of the same EQ. So this is going to be the SSL EQ, but in between that EQ I'm going to put a saturator. So I actually quite like the virtual console channel, the saturation within there. So here's the second SSL EQ. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to go to bell on both of them. I'm going to crank this first one up 15 dB and then take this one down by 15 dB. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a load of EQ into the saturation device here, VCC, and then I'm taking away that top end afterwards. So we're essentially telling the plugin to saturate that top end more because it's going to reach the point of saturation earlier. And then after the saturator, we're taking that top end away. So we're not actually making the overall signal brighter, we're just making the stuff that's past that saturation threshold brighter. You can do it with any band, and we're going to do that as well in a moment, but just take a listen to what this does. Let's play it, and we'll bring up the input, and let's bring up the drive all the way. Why not? I'm going to go to this, I think it's the Trident emulation. It sounds kind of cool. So let's press play and just bring up this input. Nice. Without it. So we're just saturating that top end. We're overall kind of squashing the sound a touch as well, but it's predominantly just in that top end. And we can adjust the amount of saturation we want using the drive control and the input and output. And that's kind of like why I like this plugin, because you can adjust the drive and the input output as well. So you can create kind of a blend of where you want that saturation to be. Let's hear it in the mix without it and then with it. Totally over the top, but just to prove the point, this is a really useful way of doing things and adding that saturation to just the top end. So why is it multiband? Well, that point of saturation, it kind of varies depending on where you adjust the settings on your saturation plugin. So on VCC, we've got a set point of saturation. And if we turn up different frequencies into that saturation, then we can turn up the saturation on that specific frequency. So I've turned up the high end by 15 dB and then in turn turn it down again. If I want to saturate the mid-range perhaps, but not quite as much, then I can turn that up, let's go for somewhere around 6 dB, and then turn it down by around 6 dB as well. And then let's just take a listen. We've got kind of a mid-range forward sound there as well. So the point of saturation stays the same, but we're just turning up different frequencies into the saturation and then in turn saturating those different frequencies more, which is quite interesting. The reason that I'm using the SSL though is because the cuts and boosts are kind of relatively similar. So we can see that. If I just go to B, so we can save that first one and just trash this, the first one's still going to be intact. So let's put the SSL there and then let's put it there as well. Let's crank that high end and then take that high end down. Let's go to the bell. I'm going to use something called the Burton EQ analyzer here. Let's just solo this track. And what this does is we can sit at either side of the plugin and we can see what the curve is essentially doing. So let's take a look. If we just bypass this completely and press play, we can see that it's relatively flat. If I then bring this into play, we've got the boost and the cut. And it's different, but it's not too different. It's relatively similar. If we take the bells off, then it's a little bit more different. We've got a bit of a boost here and a bit of a cut there. If I put the bells on, you can see how it's a little bit smoother overall. And this isn't true for all the EQ plugins that we get from Slate Digital. So let's take a look at the Neve for a start. Let's add a load of high end there and then take it away. That's far more of a curve. And even if we didn't have these engaged, we've still got quite a curve there. Even with just one, there's a little bit of a curve. And the same is true for the FGA as well, the API. Let's bring that in. Let's bring that up and let's bring that down. We can see how there's a hell of a boost going on there. So it's a good way of kind of looking at the differences between two plugins. And we can see that if we go to A, then these two, if we get rid of this saturation, are kind of relatively similar. Now, it's interesting, when you bring this in, you're kind of seeing such an enormous curve, like it's absolutely crazy, but it's really about what you're hearing. It's about what you're listening to. The reason for this is because we're saturating that top end. So in terms of an EQ curve, it's kind of not quite as dynamic and we're squashing it a little bit. You don't need to worry about that too much in this instance. Just looking at it from the point of view of these EQs, it's relatively similar. So if we actually adjust the mid-range instead, you'll see the mid-range is slightly kind of weirder. You get this strange kind of nipple in between the two. So it's not safe to say that an EQ boost in the mid-range and then a cut is going to achieve something that's flat. And indeed, that's never really the case in EQs unless it's like a super surgical digital EQ that's designed to do that kind of thing. And it's true for the low end as well. If we add a load of bottom end into there and then take it out, it's kind of a little bit of a boost, but it's a lot smoother than it would be if we were doing that mid-range stuff. In fact, if you go to a bell, you can see that it's almost exactly the same. So the bell on the low end may be a good way of doing this if you want to saturate that bottom end. But as we all know, saturation on low end is kind of a niche thing. It's kind of a weird thing, and it's not necessarily going to be useful for bringing out any kind of real saturation. But if you want to try it on a bass or a 808 or something, go crazy. But for this, if we just play this snare again and we saturate into it the same way as we did before, then we can kind of saturate different frequencies more. If I bring this down a little bit, then we're adding more of the mid-range into it. So when it hits that saturation curve, not as much mid-range, getting more mid-range there. Equally, if we bring the top end down on this one, we're getting loads more. So the SSL is a good one to use here, partly because it's kind of flat on the top end if you boost and then cut, but also it's got 4 EQ curves and you can manipulate them in kind of whatever way you want. You can get really creative with it. If you wanted to apply a broad boost and then like a narrow cut as well, then you could take out stuff in a narrow sense and boost it in a broad sense. And that would be kind of a different sound because we're just selecting a specific frequency that we don't want to saturate as much. Or you could do it the complete opposite way. If you want to really saturate a specific frequency, 3K, and then just bring down the mid-range overall, you could do that. Getting a real narrow frequency there. There's endless possibilities there, and I find this a really creative way to use the virtual mix rack because you're going into something, you're EQing into something and then bringing it out afterwards. So the SSL EQ is quite flat, so we can do this, but it's just a great way of saturating specific frequencies within the virtual mix rack to get something that's kind of greater than the initial set of saturation controls that we have. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope that's something you can play around with. It's just a great trick that I love to utilize when I want a bit more sustain in the top end, a bit more grit, a bit more kind of dirtiness. VCC, Virtual Console Channel, is a fantastic plugin, and being able to EQ into it and then EQ afterwards opens up a whole new world of possibilities. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Take care.